fantastic to be here, and I'm excited to share my show with everyone. And I'm sure, I hope that many of you, if not all of you, have been able to get out and enjoy this beautiful summer weather that we've been experiencing in November. So without further ado, I'll start the show here. And there we go. So I'm not trying to turn everybody into a bunch of storm chasers this evening, but I do have to say that it is a dangerous thing to do, so do not attempt it. But overall, just to give you a little bit of a background about myself, I've now been chasing for 19, almost 20 years, and probably a bit more than that. Just that when my dad and I first started out together, it was more of a, there's a storm that direction. Oh, is there Tim Hortons that way as well too? Try to get two for the price of one. And then eventually in 2008, 9, and 10, we got portable internet with the laptop. And then to give you an idea now, basically I can do all my storm chasing just off my smartphone. So it really does give you an idea how things have changed in that time. To give you an idea, in the early days, basically it was AM radio and visual that once we were out there, that's what we utilized to basically narrow in on the storms. So to start with, I'm going to basically start with what is kind of the most unpredictable aspect of what we do, and that is generally where lightning is going to strike. If you're a distance away from the storm, generally the better off, but when you're up close to it, there's no real way of knowing for sure where the next lightning strike is going to be. Sometimes you can get an idea of a storm that's approaching you, and it's kind of, you can see the lightning marching towards you, but sometimes they can shoot stray bolts, which you will get to see some more examples of in a moment here. So what causes lightning? Well, basically with lightning, you have this towering cumulus cloud that turns into a cumulonimbus cloud, or call it a thunderhead. And because you're not going to hear too many storm chasers out there say, oh yeah, look at the size of that cumulonimbus cloud. And basically what happens is you get the updraft going up through the storm, and then as it gets higher, of course, it gets colder as well too. So you start to get into kind of snowflakes. You might get small ice crystals, even ice, and which can be hail in the larger storms, and that too. And they basically start kind of clattering off each other. And the negative charge tends to go towards the bottom of the cloud, and the positive tends to go to the upper part of the cloud. So what will happen is when you have one that's building up here, you get an imbalance of negative and positive, and the positive is at the surface, and then the negative is in the cloud, and that's when you get a cloud to ground lightning strike like this here. And so you can see kind of how it surged through the cloud and then eventually down and across. So basically, when any object at the surface gives off what's called a positive streamer, and generally you're hoping that it's, you know, a tree, a barn, or something else, because if your hair starts to stand up and it's during a thunderstorm, it's potentially you sending up a positive leader that is trying to connect with a negative leader that is coming down, is working itself down towards the ground. So that's one of the things, that's one of the earliest warning signs, as well as a nauseous stomach, that you could be potentially hit by lightning, is the hair standing up and then a nauseous stomach as well too. So that video you were just watching, you can see the photo that I also got on another camera as well. And when it's going right through that, what was left over of that gust front, the lightning's temperature can be up to 5 times the surface of the sun, which is 30,000 degrees Celsius, 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So in this one here, I wanted to watch the lightning all of a sudden just strike the ground and go across. So you have your cloud to ground lightning strike, and then your cloud to cloud at the same time. There's another storm just off to the right there. And this is kind of a funny experience in the sense of this was down by Mitchell's Bay, south of Sarnia. And one of the things you can see here, we had the lightning come out the front, and I had a person ask me, when's the best time to probably go in for safety? And I said, 5 minutes ago. And so that was kind of one of those moments where we as storm chasers kind of have to let it get closer to us. And but overall, when you can hear, if you can hear thunder, generally you're within lightning striking distance as well too. That's why they say wait 30 minutes until you've heard the last rumble of thunder. And that too, because lightning can strike a good distance away from the rain core. And for example, where lightning struck this hill here near Brantford. And then I want you to note the direction this lightning strike is heading. It's actually heading upwards. You can actually see it go right up and across there, usually triggered by another cloud to ground lightning strike in the area as well too. So here's another slow motion version of it here. And so usually a split second before that, you have a flash, usually a cloud to ground lightning strike nearby, and then it gets triggered up a tower or CN tower or something like that too. Now, as hot as lightning is, it's actually a natural fertilizer too, the nitrogen, basically the nitrates, and they rain down to earth after. And you can see all these droplets, and that is basically gets into the rain and then falls down to the surface. So it is a natural fertilizer in that sense. We're going to start covering bolt from the blue lightning, and this tends to be the most dangerous type of lightning, or at least one of the most dangerous. As you can see, we have kind of no real visual thunderstorm there, and then you can see it come out of the storm a long distance there. I also joke this one's called bolt from the gull lightning because I had about 100 gulls flying through at the time as well too. But overall, this is the most dangerous because it's the type that can reach, 10 to 20 kilometers away from the storm. So you can see it leaving the entire thunderstorm here. We were photographing this down by Port Burwell, which you'll get to see that a bit more about that storm later on too. But you can see it's coming out of the mid to upper parts of the storm. And at one point it was thought to be actually positively charged lightning, but it is actually just a negative charge that just has a lot longer reach. A positive strike tends to be more smooth, almost like a smooth stream, and that too. So here's another spot where my dad and I had just been out maybe 3 minutes before this, and I'd been watching the lightning march towards us, and I said, okay, let's get into the vehicle, but point it this way, and that's when lightning struck about 75 meters away from our location, and you can see it hitting right in the trees there. Here's a zoomed in version. You have the first one that tends to have the most feelers, and then the return stroke of lightning has less. It's just basically one single channel. So for example, in this case, you're going to get to see, this is down towards Tilbury in southwest Ontario, and you can see a group there. And this actually all happened in 9/10 of a second. And you'll see the finish off here in a moment where it basically drains itself out. I put in the slow motion so you could really see what's actually going on here. But it's hard to believe that was all 9/10 of a second for that to take place. So when you see the photo in the next picture here, I thought I'd done really well on that because that was another camera and it caught 6 of them coming down to the ground. But that actually had about 9 to 10 strikes, as you could see on the video. So I had missed some of them in that total chaos of lightning. And then we have shelf clouds and gust fronts. So your shelf cloud tends to be that upper level there, that smooth edge, and then you have the rough gust front at kind of the lowest part of it. And that's where the warm and the cold air are meeting. So when your storm collapses like you're seeing here, generally what that is rain and hail that's all coming down towards the surface, and that's of course pushing colder air down with it. And what happens is the warm air out in front is moist and just has to lift because that cold air coming from the storm's pushing it upwards. And so, for example, there you could see that over the city of Hamilton there. Now, sometimes what will happen is you may have a storm that goes, say, north or south to north. And when it does that, sometimes the outflow, which is that cold air, that shelf-like feature on the front, it can actually go west to east. And it can leave kind of like a roll cloud feature, or basically have a real ugly look to it like this one. But there's no storm behind it because the storm's motion was actually south to north. And then the shelf cloud was basically west to east. So that's, sometimes you can see them and you go, oh, that looks like it's gonna be really bad. I still recommend that you do take the proper safety precautions because you never know unless you have radar information on what it's really actually doing, and that too. So here's one building, for example. Here's your gust front along the edge there, and then the storm billowing above. Not a very strong one in this case. It was basically near the end of the day, and there wasn't already a few storms had pushed through the area, which used up some of its energy. Here's another example here. There's your shelf cloud, and then so you can see new storms are trying to fire, but they're basically collapsing as quickly as they were growing there because that cold air is just undercutting it, and there's just not enough heat and instability in front of that outflow boundary for it to really keep going. And that too. Sometimes on the backside, though, you can get some beautiful imagery like you are here, where the storm is so narrow that at sunset, it highlights the back of the whale's mouth, which is pretty neat as well too. Whereas in this case, this one here is still fully attached to the line. You've got the dust and debris, dust basically getting kicked up there. And then the ugly kind of gust front feature. There wasn't really much of a shelf layer on this one, but it had that kind of rough looking gust front on it as well too. And then in Canada, we're kind of used to our whiteouts, but at times, especially in May, late May to early June, if we've had a dry spell, if a gust front comes through and the rain is really far behind it, you can actually end up in a brownout. It's very similar to a whiteout. It's just that everything's brown in front of you, so you don't get to really see much, just like if you were in a snow, whiteout that way too. So here's an example of it during the day. And you can see it basically again blowing upwards. This one was about maybe 200 feet up in the air, so around 70 meters. And you can just see it being blown out in front of the gust front. There really wasn't much of a storm at this point with it. It's just all wind, and then this cold front with a bit of a storm feature on it, compared to this one, which is basically a really deep shelf down towards the Windsor area. You can see the layers, and then you can see how low the gust front feature, the kind of the rough edges below it, and then eventually it went over our heads as well too. We pulled over, and you can actually see a little bit of arcing in the wires above here as the winds and the rain picked up a bit. So that was just a happy accident. We pulled over and that just happened to be going on at the same time. So this is the city of Buffalo, and you can see this is your whale's mouth feature. That's where that warm and cold air is mixing along the front of the storm. But now we're starting to get into the back of it, where the rain and the hail is happening right behind the shelf and that too. And that's where generally your strongest winds are going to be. This is where your straight line winds are going to form. And you can actually see here some of the limbs coming off the trees here. And again, this is Mitchell's Bay. And then this is what's called a wet microburst, where basically winds are over 100 kilometers an hour. It actually snapped a pine tree just about 75 meters away from us. And that was up in the Renfrew area near Ottawa. And this is what I call the photographer basically eating some soil to get the shot. My dad could have left me on that side of the vehicle, because then of course the rain eventually came and I could have cleaned my mouth out, because I was actually crunching soil for about an hour to an hour and a half after that on the chase, because of the amount I had taken in. So as you can see here, straight line winds coming in. There was actually about nickel-sized hail with this storm too. And change of pace here. I promise there's not a lot of winter in this program, but this one actually did have some thunder in it, and it was actually in the middle of February and very cold. But because of the fact that Lake Erie was still open, Buffalo was actually getting lake effect snow, and it was so intense there was actually lightning with it as well too. So you can see the band there, and I know your area does get the lake effect as well too, mainly from Georgian Bay or sometimes from Lake Huron, but generally don't get to see that kind of structure with it. Whereas the angle of the lake, the southwest flow in Lake Erie, we were actually able to really get the broad side of it, which had a really impressive look, like a gust front. And also there was a chance of snow spouts. But as you can see, these clouds are rotating, but note how they dissipate as they go inland. Well, that is actually because of the fact that we're losing the moisture and the heat, if you want to call it that, at maybe 1 or 2 degrees Celsius off the water. But it was that 13-degree difference that was allowing for, or greater, for that energy to come off the lake. And you'll learn more a bit about that later on when I cover water spouts as well too. This is caused by a cold front that went through. It basically had about 90 to 100 kilometer an hour winds with it. Then the next day we went into a deep cold, and it created what are called steam devils, and they form an Arctic sea smoke. And generally, to get really good steam devils, I find you need about an 18-degree difference between the water temperature as well as the air temperature, and even greater the better it tends to be in that case. This is actually a rare snow spout. You can see it fully connected there. It lasted for about 3 minutes. And even the straight line winds with it at times weren't able to destroy it, whereas a lot of the others were getting blown over or just completely obliterated. Whereas this is more of your classic steam devil that you can see here, very kind of harmlessly spinning and not much energy to it. Basically, when a steam devil passes through you, which I've had it do, and that it basically you just maybe feel a hint of a breeze, but the difference with it is with the water vapor in the air, the super cold water vapor, it tends to actually burn more. So you really feel it that way, but you don't really feel much of a breeze from it. And it can actually happen on ponds, even in late summer to early fall and then into the winter. This one is a spring-fed water hole. It's getting the warmer water out of the ground, and then the temperature was about -17 at that point too. So I warmed things up here now. This is basically your cumulus clouds. You got a towering cumulus here. It's trying to build, but it's collapsing. And so sometimes it takes a little time for things to get going. This one's actually towards Bradford, even though I'm south of Lake Ontario. This one was towards the Bradford area, and you can see kind of this is your classic fair weather thunderstorm, basically. It lasted for about an hour, and then you can now see the collapsing aspect of it. And then eventually it collapses enough, and you kind of see maybe one just start to develop in the background there. So when they're developing, it's actually, you get a base on it. So here's a base forming on a new storm here. And what's neat about it is the fact is that's where it's drawing in the warm, moist air to feed the storm. And we also call that kind of the business end of the storm as well too, because if there's going to be a tornado, generally it's at the back of the storm, at least when it comes to a supercell. Whereas this year, with the 30+ tornadoes that Ontario saw, most of them were actually near the front of the storm in what's called a QLCS, or quasi-linear convective system. And they were actually forming on the front, which unfortunately, a lot of them were hidden by rain as well too. When it comes to a supercell, they often have very strong updraft. So you have your amble going across flat like that, and then you can see this bubbling cloud above that flat layer there. And that's what's called an overshooting top or amble overshoot. And in this case, see how everything looks wispy and it doesn't have that real nice cauliflower look anymore? Well, when you don't have that, generally the bottom of the storm is starting to look like this, where it's basically elevating, it's starting to weaken. It's not able to take in warm, moist air. Instead, rain actually starts to cut down through where it was taking the warm, moist air before. And when it does that, that is when you can get that kind of wispy cloud, and generally the storm is basically over at that point, or getting close to being over. So now we're going to take a look at a supercell thunderstorm. It was actually tornado warned south of London. And I want you to note the rain curtains in this one. A lot of our storms in Ontario, unfortunately, for anyone, is the fact they're rain wrapped. And you can see in this case, the storm was rotating well enough that the rain curtains kind of have that kind of round shape to them. So we're kind of looking for rain curtains to be being pulled in. There's also a rainbow going through there just to add a little bit more confusion at the time as well too. But overall, radar had a traditional signature showing that there was a potential for a tornado, a hook, they call it a hook echo. And eventually though, for the town of Elmer, basically the storm collapsed or outflowed. The storm was actually still going, but it outflowed, which choked off enough of the warm air and shear to basically not be a rotating storm anymore. So what you're seeing is the development of what's going to be a roll cloud here in a moment, where it's separating itself from the storm. This was once attached to the storm, but you're starting to see that really smooth edge to it. And that's generally what you'll see with these roll cloud features, and where they have this separation, and then you can see them, they can go from kilometers on end. This one was about 20 kilometers in length, but you can see how it goes, very smooth, and then right back towards the horizon there. Kind of almost like a bow and arrow effect, but back towards the storm, you can actually get a good example of the storm was still going. And I want you to watch the center part of your screen there and see how the clouds are kind of turning in on themselves. It's kind of rotating horizontally. Well, that's that wind shear aspect. The difference is at this point, there's just not enough warm, moist air to go up and then kind of tilt that. So instead, it just kind of rolls horizontally, and you can see it going on and on here. I want you to note that kind of puffy cloud in the background there that's by the windmill, because this roll cloud eventually actually increases that cloud strength into a storm, and you'll see how volatile that storm becomes, and also its cycle as well too. So we're now heading towards the town of Port Burwell, which is right along Lake Erie, close to Long Point. You can see how much elevation the cloud has now to the back of the storm, and then the rain core there as well too. So eventually we actually get down to the shoreline here, and so you can still see the motion of the cloud being pulled in towards the storm. And here's an overall view of it as well too. So the clouds are still taking in more moist air, but just not what it needed to stay what you would call surface based. It started to become elevated, and instead of the storm actually collapsing, it just shrunk instead. So it never kind of went wispy. It just got smaller in size. So now back to that roll cloud. Remember that cloud that I told you to note earlier, and you're going to get to see that now, where basically that roll cloud is underneath. And so that roll cloud actually went underneath, and you can see where, there it is right there. You can see what's left of the roll cloud there, and that's that cold air basically going underneath that cloud, causing the warm air to rise faster than it was earlier. And then eventually, though, that cold air undercuts the storm completely and it dies out, which you'll get to see here in a moment as well too. And one of my favorite things about storms along Lake Erie, and you can get along Lake Ontario as well too, is you get the stars above the storms at times too. And so here's an example of one here. This is one that was over Lake Erie. And the funny thing about it is, as a storm chaser, sometimes you have to tell yourself to take some time off. So it was Canada Day, and I went to the fireworks with my family without the camera. Well, needless to say, there was a thunderstorm with lots of lightning. I said, the next time I see a cloud just starting to build, I'm going to be there for the first lightning shot. So it was just 2 weeks later that I was able to go out, and I did catch the very first lightning shot along with all these others. It worked out to be about 500 to 600 lightning photos out of 800. The time lapse it was just flashing about one flash every 1 to 2 seconds. So it was a really intense storm, typical July storm in the sense of having lots of static energy to it. But you can see in that aspect that there was definitely plenty of lightning. Now in this one, this updraft that you just watched there, was started at about 15,000 feet, and in about 11.5 minutes, it went up to 44,000 feet. So a real intense updraft, and it was a tornado-warned storm by Chapman. It was the first one in 2012. So here's kind of an example. You'll see this one really explode, and then this one's at the same speed as well too, but just not the same intensity. One's at 22,000 feet, and the other one's about 44,000 feet, and that too. Another thing you'll notice with updrafts on a supercell storm is a corkscrew updraft, where this one was actually doing that at first, but then it turned into your typical straight up and down updraft as well too. And then there's pileus clouds, so they kind of look like a toque or a hat on the top of the billowing cloud. And this was a tornado-warned storm heading for Cleveland over Lake Erie. And you can kind of see these updrafts that create this pileus cloud to form on top. And that's another sign of a very intense updraft on the storm. Now this one's a tornado-warned storm down towards the Welland, Port Colborne area, 2016, August 1st. Note the cloud on this side of the screen, how it's going from basically right to left. And then this is wrapping around at the back. This is what's called the rear flank downdraft. But one of the things you may notice is when it's doing that, the cloud is actually dissipating. And so there wasn't enough moisture for it to just kind of keep wrapping in on itself. So it never got organized enough to bring down a tornado to the surface. There was a scud there as well, which scud is basically can kind of take on the shape of a funnel cloud and that too, but instead of rotating, it's basically just rising straight up. And they often get called in for tornadoes because of the fact that they have this shape, they're just not doing the mechanics. And that too. So, and then you can see here's the rotation left on that storm, but basically it's now heading to the United States, and it's going to become the Americans' problem because we're done with it. We wave goodbye to the storms so often when it comes to seeing them going across Lake Ontario and Lake Erie as well too. And as I said, our rain-wrapped storms tend to be hard to see what's going on. So in this case, you can see in the center of the screen, there's a lot of movement with this one. And I tried to talk to other chasers to see if they were closer, to see if there's actually a tornado going on in there. But you can see some pretty good left to right movement with that one. So when it comes to rain-wrapped ones, you generally have to be really close to them, like we were on this Brantford one. And so you're going to see a funnel condense there. You got your condensation funnel. And then we kind of go through some trees, which Brantford area is definitely known for their trees. And so I get a little bit disorientated there. And then I notice that there's actually debris flying in the field there. It's a bit hard to see there. So this is kind of the real edit or no edit to this video, and then I'll show you, there's the funnel about halfway down. I'll show you darker and also slow it down so you can actually see some of that debris that's flying around in that sense. So I actually take a few screen grabs here so you can see some of the debris that is flying around. And then there's your condensation funnel. It actually goes to about right there and that too. So your funnel doesn't have to be right down to the surface for there to be a tornado. So there you can see some of the debris flying around. And the hard part is I also do presentations on birds as well too. So bird brain and storm brain don't always mix, because I actually said, oh my God, buddy, my friend, there's debris flying, or birds are caught up in it and are being thrown into the ground. But what it was actually a tobacco leaf field. So they were quite large leaves. And so in that sense, it basically was just throwing them into the ground. So I promise you, during this portion of the film, there was actually no birds harmed. It's just all kind of large leaves being floated around. Very weak tornado. And that too, it's just that you can see it still was able to lose some debris despite the fact the condensation was not right down to the surface. So going back to June of 2014, there was a tornado that hit the Angus area. It was the EF2 one. And we were actually further west in the Walkerton area, and there was a tornado that was reported there. And we weren't quite close enough there, but you could see kind of that triangle shape. For us, because we couldn't confirm anything, it could have been Scud, could have been the tornado. We kind of lean towards the Scud aspect unless we can actually totally confirm it. And then another one here, there was a second tornado that was reported later on. And you can see just above the barn here, start to see kind of a triangle shape in the center of your screen there. I pull it in even more, start to take hold. But even then, I kind of look at it and I'm not, to me, we just weren't able to get the right, just close enough to it to basically get the fact that was it a tornado or just Scud. So that was the tricky part about that aspect. And then of course you have the whirlwinds, and then the cousin of the tornadoes are what we call gustnadoes, far weaker. They form right along the gust front here, and you can kind of see a debris ball, if you want to call it that, but it's more of a dust ball that is basically formed at the bottom there. And you'll see when I speed it up in a time lapse here, how basically the straight line winds just overpower it and straighten it out. So all in all, they're lucky if they remove a few twigs from your trees as well too. And and then there's also what are called shear funnels. So this is a tiny little funnel on the front, and then you have a very small cloud out in front of it. So it's not your big towering thunderstorm, it's just this kind of funnel cloud that's attached to this small cloud above, and it's rotating. I find them fascinating, so I always say watch them as long as you like. And then this one here, this is what I call grocery shopping and saying I'm not going to bring the camera. Of course, you don't bring the camera, you get to the red light, and then you see the funnel cloud, which then you wait, you get to an opening, and then eventually you get to photograph or take cell phone video of it going north of your town. And then in this one, this is actually November 23rd, 2013. And you can see the funnel cloud here. This is towards St. Catharines. This was not really the neat aspect about that day. It was actually the fact that there was a tornado near Prescott in eastern Ontario, and it was snowing at the time when that tornado hit. So I don't want you looking at the next snow squall and thinking, is there a tornado in that? Because it was very special conditions for that type of thing to form. And then a year later, November 24th, I got this shear funnel near Font Hill. So they do happen at all times of the year. It's just that they tend to be a little bit more rare in the winter, or a little bit more Great Lakes reliant, because that's where if you're going to have any heat and energy, it's going to be our Great Lakes, even if they're only 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. This one here, you're going to see a funnel cloud form just under this traffic light. And as you can tell as a photographer, it's a dream shot with all the wires going through as well as the traffic light there. But eventually you see the funnel cloud form here. And what was neat about that is the fact that my dad and I are used to chasing in areas where you got the cows and the horses, so we can yell across the parking lot and not have to, or yell across the area and not have to worry about alarming anyone. Well, I was next to a Tim Hortons drive-through, and I yelled, "Dad, funnel cloud," and sure enough, there I saw a bunch of heads turn very quickly, and I motioned to them, "It's going the other way, it's going the other way." So those are a few things when we're working in an urban area, and we tend to try to be a little bit more gentle with our wording and that as well too. We are one of the few storm chase teams that will chase at night as well. And you can actually see, I put it into a screen grab here in a moment, but generally, even this is slower than what we get to see. We get a flash, and then we got to decipher what we're seeing as well as radar information. So this is towards the listful area. You have your lowering, your rotating wall cloud, basically all happening in this area. That's right at the back side there where that rear flank downdraft is coming down. So that's that dry, cool air that if it meets the inflow, it really drives the rotation in the wall cloud and potentially your funnel cloud to tornado later on. Something we keep an eye out for when we are out there is random power flashes. So notice how that one actually flashed and there was no lightning to trigger it. So that tells us potential for a tornado, more likely wind at the back, whereas in this case, you're going to get to see lightning flash, and it'll be coming up here in a moment. This was a tornado warning storm by St. Mary's, and you can see how the lightning flashed and then the lights go out. That generally tells us that it's the lightning that caused it, not a tornado taking out hydro wires and so on. And then here's the Ontario Supercell that produced a tornado in that town near Lake Simcoe. And you can see here in the lightning, the slow motion here, kind of the look at that corkscrew updraft at the back as well. And then here's the only one we've caught two at night, but this is the best one here. My dad got this photo of a water spout over Lake Erie. So we're happy to say we haven't got a tornado at night inland, because tornadoes at night are dangerous. And that, so you can't see them even for anyone that's not really a storm chaser. It's just better to have them during the day. And that some would say not at all. But if you have to pick and choose, day is definitely a time. But here's an example of a water spout. So you have your spray ring below, and then you have your funnel cloud above. And this is that 13-degree temperature difference I was talking about, where you have a convergence line that forms over the Great Lakes. And the water temperature, let's say it's 10 degrees Celsius, and then your 850 millibar level or 1500 meter level is basically, it might be -3 to -5. Generally, the greater the difference beyond 13 degrees difference between the water and the 850 millibar level, the stronger the convection is in those convergence lines, and that's where you can get some larger water spouts with that greater difference. So this one actually came inland, but while we were watching that one, we actually had one kind of basically come right in on our location, and that was a spray ring that basically came right in. So that's the bottom, that's where the water is basically going around. Of course, now it's inland, so it's basically dust that we're getting into the zone here. But this is more of your, what they call them is fair weather water spouts. But if you were in that, it wouldn't be so fair weather orientated. But generally, these form over the lakes, and yet you can be in sunshine on land. So they can be very narrow bands, very similar to lake effect and that as well too. Now this was a confirmed tornado by Listwell. You can see a bit of a funnel cloud at the top of your screen, and then your dust at the bottom. Originally for me, when I was chasing this storm, I thought it was just a gustnado, but Environment Canada did confirm it, and it was forming along the front of a typical squall line, but there was a notch on radar south of Listwell, and you can see, you'll see it get a little bit more organized in a moment here where the vortices actually tighten up, and that lighting at this point was starting to get a little bit tricky as well too. But there was also a tornado that same day in the town, near the town of Mildmay as well. So you can see a bit stronger of a vortice there that's formed. For me, to this day, I still consider it borderline tornado, gustnado, but I'm not going to argue with Environment Canada on it because they had the radar information and everything else. And there was other chasers that reported it as well too. So you can see kind of that kind of shape at the bottom. It tightens up at times. There's almost looks like there's two vortices at times as well too. And then this is when it probably was near its strongest, and that too, you can see kind of that cup shape with it, and that as well too. So now I'm going to show you a storm basically in, this is a 45-minute storm chase in 3 minutes. We sometimes wish we could drive that fast out there, but you can kind of see a gust front roll cloud feature is just about to go overhead. So as a storm chaser, it was showing rotation on radar, But when we visually saw that, we thought, okay, the storm is gusting out, but we still took a look at the bottom of it here, and you can see it looks to be gusting out. So what we did was basically, we did a circle, and we wanted to get photos of the gust front. Well, while we were working our way back to the front of it, it was actually start to regenerate, basically cycle up again. And so we stopped, and then we go here, and then we actually notice right about here that it is now forming a new rotating wall cloud. So this supercell was just cycling up again. Supercells will do that, tornadoes can do that as well too. And so we actually now have to stop and now wait for it to go by so we can get onto the back of it. You can really see that rotation taking place as it goes overhead there. So we pull over, and one of the things I want you to note too is just how low to the surface this is. Very low, and generally for a tornado to form, it takes a lot less energy for one to form when the cloud base is closer to the surface than when it is more elevated. So in this case, it was looking pretty promising in that sense, especially with the motion. We were seeing very rapid motion with the eyes. Of course, this is sped up a bit so you can see it a little bit faster and coming together. But you'll note here, this is going into it, this is your inflow. But at the bottom here, there's not a lot of motion. There's a lot of rising motion, but not a lot of motion there. And you'll also notice there's rotation here, there's kind of rotation there, there's sinking there. So it wasn't all working together. It didn't have that, what I call kind of a harmony to it, where all the wind shears working together. And by the time it did start working more so together, the storm itself had went from about 30,000 feet down to 12,000 feet. So it weakened quite a bit in that sense. So now I'm going to take you to the 2013 August 7th tornado. And this is the rotating wall cloud at this point, and it's taking in the warm, moist air. So this is between Arthur and Grand Valley at this point. And so what you have is you have your warm, moist air being pulled into the storm. And then here's your rear flank downdraft being pulled back around from the northeast at this point. And there's actually gulls going over. Some of you may have seen it on the screen there as well. And those gulls were actually following the rear flank downdraft. And then they actually come into this area here where you have the warm, moist air going into it. My dad and I often joked that we wish we had smoke out there so we could see where the warm air was going into the storm and where the cold air was pushing out, all that type of thing. Well, we just had to bribe some gulls with McDonald's, and they did the work for us. But in that sense, you can actually see how it's rotating around. So you have things starting to come together. We've already got a funnel cloud in the middle here. And we're still not 100% sure where the tornado is going to form because there was little vortices off to the side here. But now we're starting to get an idea that this side here is starting to get more organized. And note the cloud above is starting to take on more of a cylinder shape. And when you get that kind of cylinder shape to it, where it's basically all rotating and working together in harmony there, that is generally a sign that, you know, it's getting very close to potentially dropping a tornado. So at this point, you're going to actually see it in real time. You have the funnel there, and then watch the whole thing condense. It's now starting to condense right in the center of your screen there, where it's all fully connected to the ground at this point. Now, chances are it was actually probably on the ground maybe about 15 seconds before that. We were far enough away at this point that there wasn't, we weren't seeing the debris at this point. It was going through a cornfield. But there was other chasers that said it was on the ground before the condensation was right down to the surface there. You now see the tornado is also getting very well anchored in, and note the wall cloud is got that cylinder shape to it at that point as well too. So now we're pushing west to east as the tornado moves the same direction, generally a slight southwest to northeast motion with it. And you can see again that cylinder shape is looking really good, but then you'll note how the tornado almost looks like it's getting dragged behind a little bit at this point. And you actually see different vortices in it as well too. So if this had been a stronger tornado, the wooded area would not have mattered in the sense of kind of disrupting the vortices. It would have just plowed right through it. But in this case, not being the most intense tornado, it actually starts to get dragged behind. There's friction involved, and then there's disruption in the winds, the vorticity basically. And so it kind of started to get destroyed a bit more. You can actually see it even affected the whole entire wall cloud at that point. That cylinder shape has basically disappeared at that point. Now note the tornado is more upright again, so it has now passed through that wooded area and is actually on the highway when you see that flash of white there. And so when that happens, it's actually regained itself. Everything's starting to work together again as well. So that was a real interesting aspect to see it kind of get disrupted, and then to see it go back to an area where it wasn't getting disrupted by the surface objects and that as well too. So I hop out of the vehicle, my dad's pulled us over, and you can see we have the tornado still going, despite the fact that it doesn't look like it's on the ground. It is actually still going at this point, which you will get to see later on. But as I'm going across a field to try to make a tornado look pretty with photos, I also have, the storm also has a secondary area that is developing off to the south there, or to the right. And so I'm just showing you the motion. As the tornado continues on, there's one or two things this secondary area could become. It could become the main tornado, or something that's called a satellite tornado, where it goes around the tornado. But generally that is on the rotating wall cloud, where you'll get a satellite funnel cloud or a satellite tornado, whereas this one here has more of its kind of its own independence. So you can see a funnel cloud now has formed, and also note the cloud above is not very firm or very tall. So it's having a hard time getting enough energy to it while the other tornado keeps going. And so typically, even out here, you can see the condensation reaches here, and then there's a bit of a gap there. So this is just remaining basically that horizontal wind shear, kind of what you saw earlier with that one storm where the tube is just kind of going horizontal. So I speed it up here, and you can actually see the funnel is going one direction, then it changes to the other direction as well too. So kind of neat to show both sides of that band of rotation there basically happening. And then I come back from my 125-meter dash. I get one more photo. You can see it's a good length. It's just not a strong enough updraft to, well, there was a strong enough updraft to cut the funnel cloud, but not enough of a rear flank downdraft to basically push it down towards the surface. So as we continue on, the tornado is actually still on the ground despite the fact that condensation is halfway up. You actually see a bit of the dust there in the center of your screen, but I will show you a better example near the end of this tornado's life cycle, because it does hit some larger pieces of debris. Now, something the cloud is still telling us, the telltale sign of the fact that it's still pulling in warm, moist air from the right side of your screen. You can kind of see a band, and then it mixes in with the rear flank downdraft. But you can now see the tornado itself, the base of it is basically getting more elevated. So we know it's near the end of its life cycle here too. So my dad often jokes with me, because I like foreground in my photos. There's a barn in the background there, but he often jokes with me, hey, oh, there's a barn. Do you want to get a picture now? Because I often, like I said, like to work that into the foreground. So of course we pulled over here, and we basically get the tornado near the end of its life cycle. And so I hop out of the vehicle, but I'm going to first show you the debris. So there's a couple of the larger pieces of debris there that are being pulled up into the tornado still, basically. So it does show you that even though the condensation is less than half at this point downward towards the ground, it has still got enough winds at the surface to be locked in some very large debris. Fortunately, with this one, what was neat is the fact the funnel cloud actually kind of retracted back into the cloud base. Usually they do something what's called rope out, and they basically dissipate almost what looks like in thin air. Whereas this one, it seemed to want its funnel back. So at this point now, the storm is actually heading towards both Orangeville and Caledon. And one of the good things about it at this point, as I'm sure many of you will actually say, that's a good thing when it's heading towards the Caledon direction, is the fact that the base is now a lot higher and it looks very disorganized. The base does eventually reorganize more, but you can tell compared to that tornado, it's much higher off the ground at this point. So you can really see that if it does form another tornado, it's going to take a lot more energy to do so. So eventually, it is able to form this funnel cloud. And that they did report a tornado potentially with it, but I wasn't able to confirm anything officially myself. But you can see now we've got a funnel cloud. Of course, I've got my barn in the scene as well too, as I was also taking photos of it. And I want you to watch in the time lapse. This one basically dissipates in thin air, but I want you to watch in the center of your screen at the top. When you see the center of your screen, notice the rotation right in the actual cloud. And one of the neat things about this storm was it collapsed so quickly that it almost acted like an X-ray where we could see some of the inner vortices that were happening at the time. So in the center of your screen, I put it on a replay here and slow motion, you can actually see the vortice in the center there rotating above. So even though we can't always see what's going on in the storm, there's generally vortices and rotation going on inside the clouds as well too, that we just can't see because of the outside of the clouds. Here's some of that larger debris that it hit and caused it to kind of drag back behind. Forget about all the Chapman names here. It's actually just because the superhero movies do this where they put the bonus clip at the end. So in this one, I went with lightning, and I do slow it down because usually in my live audiences in front of them, I get them to count how many strikes they see that one particular bolt do. And to give you an idea, some people have got as high as 30, generally kids. They have more energy. I think they're just counting as much as they can in that period of time, but generally the answer is between anywhere from 8 to 12 strikes over and over again. So I've never truly counted because I like to hear the variations and answers in that aspect. So that is the presentation. So I will open it up here to our questions, and I see our chat box does have a number there, and that's a good sign. And then Deborah, I'll get you back.
I thought I'd unmuted myself. Now I'm back.
That's okay.
So I've just thrown another note out into the chat so that if you can't find it, that's where it is. If you have any questions, you can put them in. But David, I see two definition questions right off the top. Can you give us a quick definition of what a whiteout is and what a supercell is?
Okay, well, we'll start out with the winter aspect, and that is the fact that a whiteout is basically when you're just driving down the road, and sometimes, most commonly with snowbanks, where there's an area where the snow is just blowing right in front of you, and basically once you're in a complete whiteout, you have basically you can't see in front of you, and so that's generally your whiteout. It's just basically a wall of white until you get through that potential area. Sometimes it's very quick, and then there's times where I've been in a whiteout as much as 20 to 25 seconds, and that's where it kind of gets a little bit more hair raising. So that's your winter weather, and that I have experienced some of those actually in microbursts as well too, as recent as the October 23rd storms that came through, and that too. So it can happen with microbursts, but generally when you think of a whiteout, it is winter. And as for a supercell, that's a great question. So basically a supercell is your rotating thunderstorm. So smoke, and you get warning systems like the smoke detector going off as well too. Fortunately, there's someone else that so fortunately, someone will look up. There we go. And must have known we were on supercells. So supercell is basically a rotating thunderstorm, and that's generally where you get 90% of your tornadoes from, is your supercells. And not to mention the fact that most of them actually cause damage as well, which is about that 90% range again as well too. So yeah, I thought that was pretty funny as well. And so next question here we have is when you have a tornado on the ground, how do you go about the unpredictability and how to judge the distance for chasing? So generally we have to go by visual cues and knowing the storm's motion as well. And so in that aspect, we kind of gauge on how close we're going to get with it. And so always keeping a good distance, especially at night, we tend to stay further back. They are unpredictable, but with years of practice of doing it, you can kind of get an idea or have a good idea on where it's going. Where they become unpredictable is those ones that are big wedges, and because those big wedges are actually vortices inside what looks like a large tornado, but there's also vortices inside them, and they can actually come out at 150 to 160 kilometers an hour any direction they want. And so that's where if it's a wedge tornado where it's very large, a wedge is basically can be half a kilometer to 2 to 3 kilometers wide. Those are the ones that you want to give a lot of wide berth to if you're a chaser in that aspect. So that is that's basically how we try to gauge it as well. So I'm actually scrolling back here to get to the next question.
The next one is if you can recommend any social media sites or websites for more information. And fantastic visuals.
Okay.
Yes,
So,
agreed.
yeah, one of the a good website is Instant Weather Ontario. That's more of an app now, but they are the best for getting kind of the watches and warnings out to you very quickly on their apps because they actually go towards your area. Environment Canada now has that as well too. It's been so long that I really don't use websites anymore for the weather aspect. I generally, it's social media. Twitter is probably one of your quickest when it comes to news and weather related. The hashtag OnStorm is probably one of the most used ones. Whenever there's a bit of weather in Ontario, it seems to be trending on there. So hashtag OnStorm is one I would recommend on Twitter. And even if you don't have a Twitter account, you can just put it into Google and then hashtag OnStorm and then go into Twitter and you still get all the OnStorm information as well. And then there's another one too, hashtag OnWX. So again, Ontario, so ONWX. So those are probably your best when it comes to getting information quickly, and that as well too.
Great.
And then, so what is a microburst? So a microburst is basically when you have this large thunderstorm that's been taking in this warm, moist air, and then when the cold starts to it starts to outflow, basically cut off that warm, moist air going into it. What went up must come down, and sometimes it basically shuts down so quick where the whole storm can collapse. And that is basically where you get a lot of your straight line wind damage in that, because of course that rain, some of that moisture is coming from, 20, 30, 40,000 feet in height. And then as it gets closer to the ground, the pressure builds up as well as the speed builds up as well too. And then that hits the ground, doesn't even have to hit the ground, but all that pressure, it can then kicks out sideways. And that's when you get some of the most damaging microbursts. There's actually been one recorded, I believe, up to 225 kilometer winds with that. So that gives you an idea that microbursts can be similar to tornadoes in the intensity, just not the twisting action generally with them. And oh yeah, no apologies for the questions. It keeps me sharp, so that's okay. No problem there at all. So I don't mind, and so happy to answer them in that. So, so let's see here. Oh, Andrew
Macklin is your next
guest.
Yes.
I follow him on Twitter, a fellow storm chaser as well. And let's see here. Where is your favorite or underrated area to chase in Southern Ontario? Well, to answer that question, I would have to say the Niagara region, because it's often where people joke to say the storms come to die, and I live here. And so I would say the best, it is the most underrated, because even though we don't get a lot of tornadoes here, we tend to get a lot of smaller supercells that take on the structure of them. They just don't produce the tornadoes. We also get microbursts here as well. Just not as many storms as that you would see, say, I know north of Toronto there, for example, you see more Alliston, Caledon, Orangeville, and that too. Underrated as well. I'm trying to think, London is known for it, Windsor is known for it, and that I have chased in the Bancroft area, and they do get some powerful storms. It's just, you don't get to see a lot generally there as well because of all the wooded areas. And I think up until the tornado that hit the Ottawa area a few years ago there, basically it was an underrated area as well, whereas now people think of it as the alley, and it's always been kind of the secondary alley in Southern Ontario. Also, as someone who has been chasing for many years, do you find that storm seasons in Ontario follow a pattern, such as higher intensity years clumped together, or are they sporadic? That's an excellent question, and sounds like a storm chaser as well too. So I find there does seem to be kind of clumps together. You can look back through historical data when it comes to tornadoes and you think, oh yeah, we average about 13 per year. But there's times where we hit 20, 25 tornadoes, or even this year 30. But generally, it's outbreaks that sometimes bring up our average, whereas there's years that we can go, we get 5 to 7 tornadoes, and you may get a series of years like that too. So you can get those kind of years that clump together. And the only thing I would say I've noticed in the recent years is our thunderstorms don't seem to be getting any worse, really. What I find is our windstorms are becoming a little bit more common in the fall and in the spring, and even in the winter. Than I'm used to when I first started chasing. So our straight line wind events with these fall storms and November gales seem to be where we get sometimes December gales, February gales, and so on. So that is one thing I've kind of noticed that has changed over my chasing career. Have you noticed a color change in the sky when a tornado cloud is near? I've been told green or orange. So when it comes to the green, doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a tornado, but what it is there's generally hail in the storm, which is a sign that there's a very strong updraft. But of course, you can get hail in a thunderstorm that doesn't have the right shear to cause a tornado, but it's still got a very rapid and strong updraft. So when that takes place, you can still get a green sky, but not necessarily mean that there's going to be a tornado. Still, though, it's best to take that shelter because it's obviously a strong storm regardless of if there's a tornado on it or not. And then as for the orange sky, that orange sky tends to be more in the evening lighting. It's more of how the sun is coming through the cloud, and it's not necessarily anything to do with ice, like the green aspect when it can be right in the middle of the day and still get that green sky, whereas the orange tends to be in that last kind of hour and a half. So that tends to be more sunset related in that aspect. As for my favorite part of being a storm chaser, so a lot of people think that, storm chasers, we all want that big tornado, and that's actually not my goal. Or if I do get the monster tornado someday, it's not important to me. What I like to do is get the smaller ones and figure out the puzzle, reading the weather models and going over historical data and being in that right place for the right time. Because to me, it's not the size of the tornado, it's just the fact that it's being there for that moment from start to finish, so you can capture the whole process and be able to show people like yourselves, that whole aspect of how they develop and how they form. So for me, the thrill is actually in the piecing the puzzle pieces together and trying to be in the right spot at the right time. Let's see here. Where am I at here? This has been great questions so far. So what's the difference between an updraft and a downdraft? Basically, the updraft is when you have that warm, moist air going into the storm. And then the downdraft is the sinking air that brings the rain and the hail. So generally a storm when it first forms like that little cumulus cloud, that cumulus cloud is what basically takes in that warm, moist air, and then it starts to tower upwards and develop and develop. So first you only have an updraft, but eventually what happens is that starts to kind of soften. It reaches a level where it's right at that point where it's neutral, and then it starts to kind of fall, and then that starts to establish the downdraft. And then so what will happen is you have your downdraft and then your updraft behind, and then as it goes down, it kind of helps push more warm, moist air up on the next updraft, but then that cycles down, and if a storm's meant to, it'll just keep going and going. So squall lines can be very much that way, or what are called multi-cells when it comes to the tornadic aspect, or not the tornadic, but the updraft and downdraft aspect there. So so that was a great question too, because that's basically going right back to the whole aspect of how a storm builds, or even a cloud builds. And yes, Niagara does get overlooked in the chase community quite a bit. I just happen to live here because I'd probably, if I didn't live here, I'd probably overlook it myself as well. And that too is just I have to go home at some point and that. So as for, let's see here, I missed one earlier there from JP. You're welcome, and I'm happy to become a chaser, and I want to be as safe as I can, and actually do need to leave, but it was amazing being here. So yeah, overall, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it, JP, and I hope you get to see all the storms that you're dreaming of, basically. And let's see here, Mount Forest area. Mount Forest area had a lot of activity this year and has some good side roads and views. What parameters do you look for in Southern Ontario that get you out to chase versus staying home? So in recent years, I've become a lot more picky because of the fact that I've been doing it for so long, and then also have other work that I have to do as well too. But some of the parameters I look for is basically, there's a parameter in the forecast, effective shear or bulk shear. I look for generally a minimum of 30 knots. There's also the lift index, which is basically your warm moist air lift. I'm sure you probably know this, it's just for everyone else, that lifting mechanism. And I look for about -4 a lift to kind of get me going, as well as dew points that are between, well, they can vary at time of year, but generally in the summer, for example, I look for dew points of 17, 18, preferably 20 and higher, but generally 17 will still, that's pushing me a bit now, but I was still in the past because of the fact that generally the higher or lower your dew point, the less surface based the storm is going to be. So unless you have a very drastic cold front coming through, which helps with the temperature variation that you're looking for to help make it surface based. But generally, those are the key components I'm looking for. I'm probably missing a few. I know the quick way, sometimes when I'm lazy with the weather models, I'll look at the supercell parameter and be like, is it worth me digging deeper into it as well? So those are just a few of the parameters that I do look for when it comes to that aspect.